Well, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to express some ideas. I came into Islam as a young student when I was attending the University of California in Santa Barbara. That was back in 1968, 69. I was introduced to the concepts and ideas of the Nation of Islam. I was already deeply moved by the Muslim movement, having read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I was very impressed with Malcolm's description of the discipline and structure of the Nation of Islam. And I said in the back of my mind, even though I wasn't looking for religion, if I had ever gotten serious about a community of order and discipline, that it would be the Nation of Islam. But I continued just my association with Muslims and not being serious. My transformation did not take place until 1970. Having come back home during the summer of '69 to be involved here in some grassroots movement, including the UBAD, and having gone through that experience, I think it was just around the time for my metamorphosis, because at the end of that experience, in 1970, is when I officially joined the Nation of Islam. Quite rapidly, I wrote the Honorable Elijah Muhammad when I accepted the Nation of Islam. Told him I was from Belize and that I wanted to learn as much as I could from the Nation of Islam in order to go back to Belize and to establish a temple, what was called the Temple of Islam in those days. Surprisingly, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad answered my letter after being in the Nation of Islam for about a year and a half. In early '72, I got invited by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad to come to Chicago. And I was in Chicago for approximately 2 weeks during the period of July of 1972. I was there as the guest of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and had an opportunity to meet with him and to have face-to-face conversation with him for 11 different occasions on that 2-week period that I spent in Chicago. During that period, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad spoke to me about many things. Primarily, he wanted me to represent him and represent the Nation of Islam in Belize. And so he was giving me instructions on what to expect when I come home, and that he would, and the Nation of Islam would support me while I'm here. The support was promised because at that time, the Nation of Islam had leased 55,000 acres of land in the Toledo district. And he wanted someone who would be responsible for looking over this investment. And the objective of that investment was to grow food here in Belize that would be exported to the Nation of Islam. At that time, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had opened several grocery and supermarkets and outlets of that kind in different cities where the Nation of Islam was, such as Chicago, different parts of Illinois, New York, Philadelphia. And the idea was that crops would be grown here in Belize and exported back to the United States. He also, at that time, intended to bring in fish into the Nation of Islam. And so I was responsible for sending up boxes of snapper, grouper, jack, those types of fish to decide whether or not the nation would import fish from Belize. Eventually, it was the nation of Peru that offered a better financial package, and so instead of Belize, Peru became the country that exported a fish called whiting, which was headed and gutted and sold in the States. We have a better fish in Belize, the snapper, the grouper, the jack. These are more high-grade fish. The whiting is a low-grade fish. But it was a matter of economics, and I believe that was the reason why they bypassed Belize and imported the fish from Peru. But while I was sent down to Belize by the Honorable Bilal Muhammad, looking at these areas of business, the primary reason was to establish a temple here in Belize. Prior to my coming home, an effort had already been made by Brother Charles X. Egan, later known as Brother Abdullah, and his companions, Brother Ishmael Shabazz and Brother Rudolph Farrakhan. Before I returned to Belize, these brothers had also made an effort to establish the presence of the message of the Nation of Islam here in Belize. And justice was effective. They did not build a community. They did not have a wide range community as was done during our period. But clearly, people came to know about the Nation of Islam. They came to know about the concepts of the white man and black man is the original man. These ideas from the Nation of Islam were in fact promoted by Brother Justice, Brother Abdullah, as he was later called, and Brother Ishmael Shabazz, who I think did far more. And I think their success was primarily in the Motomaro area, where they revived that village, an ancient village from early Belizean history. That village was actually given a revival when Brother Justice went in there, along with Brother Shabazz and Brother Farrakhan, Brother Rudolph Farrakhan. So when I came home in 1972, not much of that effort was going on. The brothers had joined into UBAD, and so not much of the Islamic community effort was seen at that time. As a matter of fact, there was no community, there was no temple, there was no effort outside of the fact that in the village of Motomoro, that was always considered the village where justice got started, the village where the Muslims had paid great attention. There was also a school there called Muhammad School. It was started by Brother Ishmael. And even though its curriculum and its teacher and everything were all Christians and nothing about Islam was taught, the fact is that the name of the school was Muhammad School in the village of Motomoro. When I came in 1972, when I returned in 72, I returned in an official capacity in the sense that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad named me as his representative. I was put in the Muhammad Speaks newspaper as the representative of the Nation of Islam in Belize. And we had as an objective, very specifically, to establish a Muhammad's temple. And our first effort was on Blue Street. In 1972, we opened up the temple in October of 1972. And so that effort there, which started to grow and mushroom, eventually moving from there to Crawl Road, from Crawl Road to Racecourse Street, and then from Racecourse Street we started making the effort in 1985 to Central American Boulevard, and that is where we are today. The unique thing about that effort in 1972, in October of 1972, is that we started an effort that did not stop and has not stopped by the grace of God, even up to now. We have never in 1 week from 1972 to 2015 had 1 week where there was not an Islamic meeting or a Jummah or a Ta'aleem or something of the kind. In other words, the community has never died. It has maintained its presence and growth in the Muslim community from 1972 until now in 2015. Thank Allah for that. And the effort and the work of so many brothers and sisters over the years who have been responsible in their own way of contributing to the presence of the Muslim community in Belize today. The thing about the effort is that in 1972, when we came, I was the minister of the Nation of Islam. I was one of the youngest ministers in the Nation of Islam at the time, because I was only 22 going on 23 years old. And certainly I was the youngest to be given a post of being a minister outside of the United States. At that time, the community, while there were Muslims that had traveled to different places, we were the first in Belize to establish an official temple outside of the United States. Second came Jamaica with Prince Buster and them that came later, and then much later came Bermuda with Minister Byron, and then after the time of Imam Nuri Muhammad, there were efforts in Guyana, in Trinidad, and these other places. But under the Nation of Islam, Belize was the first to actually establish an official temple outside of the continental United States. And in 1975, the Honorable Bilal Morris died. God have mercy upon him and bless him. When he died, his son, Imam Nuri Muhammad, took over the Nation of Islam and began a gradual but very radical transformation of the Nation of Islam from its own insular philosophy to the broad context of the Islamic universal approach to the Muslim faith that was practiced by the majority of Muslims around the world. The Nation of Islam had its own peculiar approach to many of the tenets in the universal Quranic view of Islam. And when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad died, his son courageously began to adopt many of these universal principles, basically saying to the community that the time prior to the death of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was in fact a growing period, a sort of an incubator if you will, where the special needs of the African American and those who had been in the diaspora had to have been put into this environment to bring us up to appreciating our unique historical circumstance. This is another conversation, but basically what he was saying is that the Nation of Islam was a necessary, rudimentary period for African Americans to understand the history of how they got into this part of the world, what was the destructive process, especially mentally, that took place to degenerate them as a people, and that the nation was a prescription to address that dysfunction and to bring back a certain discipline. But that once that discipline was intact, then it was necessary to begin to adapt the international, universal principles of Islam, as opposed to remaining in that incubative state which the Nation of Islam was originally set up for. So after the death of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the nation began to evolve. And in that evolution in Belize, we were able to maintain that thrust, that we never became contradictory in any way. We did not suddenly wake up one day and start to condemn the Honorable Elijah Muhammad because we read the message of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and understood more clearly the message of the Quran and the message of the Sunnah. When we came into that knowledge, because of the guidance that we had with our teacher, Imam Muhammad, it wasn't difficult for us to place the nation into a context. And so we did not end up being like some of our colleagues, that when they came into this knowledge, they turned around and they started to condemn Elijah Muhammad and condemn Farad Muhammad, and they wanted to put this big distance between them and the Nation of Islam. They didn't want to even acknowledge there was such a person as Farrakhan. They went into a great denial about their past. Thank Allah, we didn't have this, Brother Bilal. We had a seamless transition, in the sense that in 1975 we had great respect for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. In 1985 we still had that great respect. In 1995 that respect began to increase because we had greater knowledge to understand really what that transition was about. By the time we got to 2005, we were in fact looking at the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Master Farad Muhammad as extremely unique persons within the context of the dawah work or the propagation work of Islam in this part of the world. And we were not seeing Master Farad Muhammad as God. We were not seeing Elijah Muhammad as the messenger of Allah in the context of the Quran. But it did not take away from the great human effort that was made and great genius on the part of these men in getting a community like the Nation of Islam started within the context of the challenges that were faced by African Americans within this area. And I can say that now when we look back retrospectively and see historically how the Nation of Islam evolved. And if you could do it dispassionately, in fact, if you could look at the history of the Nation of Islam as an anthropologist, even if you were to look at it in the small laboratory of Belize, but look at it with the eyes of an anthropologist, you could actually see a great evolution that has taken place in the community. In that we started off with a concept and an idea that was very foreign to many of us. But we have been able to place that context or place those concepts into a context that we could relate to we could relate to the fact that our slavery should not have been discarded. Many people say, when you come to Islam, don't talk about no slavery, don't talk about yesterday. The important thing that no, we were able to say you cannot understand now without understanding the antecedents of what created now. You cannot discard the fact that we were brought from a certain level of civility, and as a result of 300-400 years of an oppressive condition, that we dropped from that very civilized level that we were into looking at ourselves as slaves. When we started to look at ourselves in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, we were looking at ourselves as subhumans that were dependent on Europeans to get an acknowledge of our humanity. We saw that we had to pass through their approving line before we were dignified. What was happening there? It was that here we had Caucasians that were human just like us, born just like us, but somehow in our mind we had created a superior inferior relation with them, we being the inferior, them being the superior. Now, a lot of that is blatant in some jurisdiction, and in other jurisdiction it was very subtle. In the American jurisdiction it was very blatant because you have examples of lynching, you have desegregation, you have high levels of discrimination, so it's very easy for you to see the black and white divide. But in areas in the Caribbean, and in particular Belize, we didn't see those dividing lines as blatantly. We didn't have lynching. We didn't have circumstances where the discrimination was so obvious that we were able to feel like we're in two different worlds. That was the American experience. In the Belizean experience, some of us actually believe that this is for we. We have control over this. No white man can't come here and tell we don't. So we were, in a way, in denial in our jurisdiction about the impact of slavery on us, despite the fact that on Regent Street and these places you could actually walk and find little quarters that were considered the slave quarters, despite the fact that we could see the history of slave rebellions up the Belize River, despite the fact that we still have this lighten up your color working in us, where some of us feel like to marry somebody light skin, or somebody, if you're dark skin, you will find somebody to lighten up your color. All of these dynamics were going on, but we never analyzed them. We never really went into any depth in understanding it. Well, the Nation of Islam, and certainly the time of Nuri Muhammad, gave us an opportunity to do that analysis, to understand that there is an inferiority complex, and that there is a need for us to get rid of what he called the artificial mind and come into your own mind, which is a natural God-given mind. There is no superiority among you between black and white. There is no inferiority automatically between black and white. But that a lot of it has to do with circumstances. We were put in circumstances that made us inferior, and they were put in circumstances that made them superior. But it is not God that made it that way, but the circumstance. So once we got enlightened with the power of the environment to influence you, it was, to me, a great liberation of my mind, because it made me then not ascribe inferiority or superiority to any human being. So when I began to walk and trod this land, when I started to influence my children or anybody who came under my influence, I promoted that idea of you're born great and then you make yourself weak. You're born with qualities which God says makes you superior, but then you follow a path that increases or decreases that natural power that is in you. And that you could also look and see how an environment and can be engineered to actually make people live on these inferior levels. So it became a liberation to me, and it gave me an awareness of how to analyze situations from a religious standpoint, but not an overly scripturally religious standpoint. So therefore, I was a religiously based leader, but I was not a pontificating, wakron, like I am on some different level because I am religious. So I started then to see Islam as both my religion and my ideology. I started to understand that if you take Islam only as a religion, then your interest is in sitting down with people and talking about prayer, about the oneness of God, about the majesty of fasting, about charity and helping one another. And I started to see that that is not much different than any religious person. Whether I be a Christian and its various forms of Christianity, I wouldn't be much different if that was my approach to Islam. But I saw that Islam was more than just a religion, but that Islam was in fact an ideology. It was a worldview. It was a conception of how you will deal with reality. And the more I began to study and understand that approach, the more I began to see that Islam was not just my religion, but Islam was also my ideological frame of reference for analyzing the things around me. And so as a result of this, being the Imam of the community, which is a religious community, a lot of even my colleagues within the community started saying, why, Nuri is more political now. Because I didn't stop having arguments about Belizean independence. I didn't stop having issues about Belizeans dealing with the Guatemalan claim. I didn't stop having issues about why so much black boy they go to jail. I didn't have a problem with this approach in being a part of the conversation of Belizean development. Had I remained looking at Islam just as a religion and perceiving myself as a religious leader, then I would have confined myself only to religious conversations and religious debates. And so when we want to talk about how many angels can dance on the top of the needle, then you call me because when I sit down and I want to quote scripture and you want to quote scripture and we go through. I did not want to be involved in that because that was not my calling. My calling was to be God-centered, but to be very much update in terms of analyzing the circumstances that we're in. So as a result of that, Brother Bilal, I have been able over the years, over these 45 years, to have played varying roles. I have not just been a quote-unquote religious leader or imam, but because of this breadth and scope of understanding of Islam, I've been able to participate in the actual dialectics of what's going on in Belize. I'm in the conversation, whether we're talking about crime, whether we're talking about the dysfunctions at the street level, when we're talking about working inside of the prison, when we're talking about the politics. I've even been able to, with this approach, work in as high office as the press officer for the Prime Minister. So I've been able to move around. I've been able to participate in radio programs as the host of programs. I've been able to travel in different parts of the world representing Islam and even representing the government of Belize. I've been able to travel extensively. It's not a country in the Caribbean that I haven't been. I've been throughout Central America, South America. I've been blessed to be in the United States and Mexico and Canada. I've had a chance to travel in different parts of the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, even as far as Australia and New Zealand. So I've had the opportunity, by the grace of God, to be able to get a wide variety of experience of the human experience. The human experience. And so with that, I have been able, with this approach, to feel myself genuinely a citizen of the world. I've genuinely been able to feel myself very much a part of the global challenges that is affecting the human family. And I'm saying this because it's very easy, if I didn't have this scope, to have been narrowed down. And I've seen some of my colleagues along the way that have really, they've gotten stuck in a particular frame of reference. And that frame of reference has in fact enslaved them to a particular, almost, like being stuck in a time warp. And me, by the grace of God, I am alive mentally and spiritually in August of 2015 as a person who is still growing and a person who is still absorbing information and still drawing in. I am not looking for another ideological framework. I have it. But this frame of reference allows me to take new information, new circumstances, new situations, and within that context to come up with approaches. And so, in closing, I would say that from that young boy in his early 20s, being radicalized by the Black Panther Party and the Black Students Movement, and being radicalized by generally what was going on in the 60s, the Vietnam War, the assassination of Malcolm, the assassination of Martin Luther King. All of these circumstances was an early molding period that made me eventually take that move into the Nation of Islam, which was a very restrictive frame of reference. And then to have gone through that very strict and very focused period until the passing of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and then having my frame of reference opened and broadened as it was in that early period by Imam Muhammad, and then taking on my own self-study and my interacting with so many teachers and scholars, some in person and many in reading, studying the wonders of the internet, to be able to do research, to not accept an idea until you can see it verified, to be able to hear something that someone can present to me about Islam and to be able to tell you right away which area of deviation they're coming from. I credit a lot of that with having been blessed with the insight that God has given me to be able to know what are the fundamental traditional scope of Islam, coming from the Quran, from the Hadith, from the Tabaeen, from the traditional scope of Islam, to understanding the variations of the Shia, the others who have come in through the years, the different approaches that have been made, the Islamic revolutionaries, the Khomeini, the Imam Maududi, Mulana Maududi, the Sayyid Qutb, the Hassan al-Banna, the early scholars that came, Afghani and others who came in the modern era, and then coming all the way up now to these modern scholars, some of whom are staying in the tradition and some of whom have vied in these various tangents. I'm saying that my blessing and what has given me or riveted me is having that experience that have made me learn Islam within the context not only of a school of thought or a narrow confine, but having been able to grasp the roots of Islam so that I can understand it and appreciate all the various areas that I may come in contact with. You cannot learn to appreciate Islam except within the context of a family. And I have been very fortunate to have been married to Sakina Muhammad for over 40 years. And over that 40-year period, she and I had and have 5 children. And by the grace of Allah, 14 grandchildren out of that. And I think that my growth is also because of that womb. Because I married as a young man, having had a previous marriage, but that marriage there 40 years ago was my coming into manhood and the responsibility then of manhood. And watching my children grow and then watching them have children and then going from transition of father to grandfather, and then I have a granddaughter who is about 22 years old. So I'm wondering if I will also make the transition from father to grandfather to great-grandfather. And so that has also been a very great contributor to nailing me down. Because if you don't have a family, you could really float. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that marriage is half of your faith. And I've always reflected on that, saying that this is why Islam does not encourage what one would call celibacy or staying by yourself and not having the challenge of a wife and children in the case of a man. Because when you're alone and you're talking only to yourself, it's not the same as when you're talking to somebody who's responding to you in real time. When you're talking to yourself, sometimes you tell yourself what yourself wants to hear. And you could really delude yourself from reality. But when you have somebody who is with you, even if their response to you is a crotchety one, and you got to deal with that, it's putting it into a context all the time. And the survival of the two of you will tell a lot about the character of you both. And then if you have children and you have to watch the children themselves evolve, and that they're following what they gain from you, and that they can reach adulthood and you're proud of them, that also validates that you were more real than you were just talk. Because if you were just talk, you would see the results crumbling as they grow. But if you gave them real substance, if you gave them something that has ballast to it, then that also serves to validate you. And so a lot of what I have become and I am is because of that context of that other half of my religion, which is my family. And I say that because no interview about who I am and what my future is would make sense if I didn't place it within that context.